The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange as the river shimmered in the fading light. The towering baobab trees stood still, their shadows stretching long across the earth. A dog sniffed the ground near the riverbank, his ears perked, his movements alert. The air carried a strange stillness, and his paws slowed. Something felt different. A faint cry broke the silence. The sound was soft, almost like a whisper carried by the breeze. He froze, his head tilting, the cry tugging at him. It came again, weak and desperate, rippling through the quiet. Without hesitation, he bounded toward the river, his eyes scanning the reeds. There, just beyond the edge of the water, lay a tiny figure. Her shimmering tail flickered faintly, its light fading with each shallow breath. Her body, bruised and fragile, rested against the rocks. The dog edged closer, his nose nudging her gently. She didn't move. Urgency filled him and he let out a sharp bark, his voice echoing across the village. Another bark followed, louder, more insistent. The quiet was shattered by his cries, his determination clear. Help had to come. Through the trees, someone came running. Her feet barely touched the ground as she hurried toward the sound. The barking grew louder, leading her straight to the river. Her eyes widened as she reached the bank and saw the small, fragile creature lying there. Her breath caught. "What is this?" The question hung in the air as she dropped to her knees. Her hands hovered over the figure, unsure if it was real. The shimmering tail, though dim, was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Her voice softened, disbelief laced in her words. "Is this real?" She leaned closer, her eyes scanning the tiny body for signs of life. The creature's small hand twitched, drawing her attention. A faint whisper broke the stillness. "Help me." The words were so soft they were almost lost in the breeze, but they reached her ears, pulling her out of her shock. Determination replaced fear, her hand steadied as she touched the tiny figure. "I'll help you," she whispered back. Her mind raced. There was no time to waste. Whatever she needed to do, she had to act now. She glanced at the dog, who stood firm beside her, his eyes locked on the fragile creature. "We'll save her," she said quietly. And with that, she made her choice. With care, she lifted the tiny figure into her arms, her heart pounding as she rose. The river seemed to shimmer faintly as if watching, the fading light casting an otherworldly glow over them. Her steps were swift, her resolve unwavering. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them. For now, the only thing that mattered was saving the fragile life cradled in her arms. Zola carried the heavy basket on her head, her arms aching from the day's endless chores. Her aunt's sharp voice echoed in her mind, always demanding more. The ground felt rough beneath her bare feet, but she kept walking, her thoughts drifting to a dream she often repeated in quiet whispers. "One day, we'll leave this place," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the breeze. The dog by her side wagged his tail, his steady presence a comfort in the silence. The dog paused, his nose brushing against the earth. He watched her with eyes that understood her sadness, as though he too dreamed of a different life. She crouched down, scratching his ears. "You're all I have," she said softly. His tail thumped against the dirt, his loyalty speaking louder than words. By the riverbank, her knees touched the ground. Her fingers reached out to the tiny creature lying still, her breath shallow, her form fragile. The shimmering tail, broken and cracked, caught the fading sunlight. She traced the deep scratches running along the delicate fins. Her hands hovered, unsure, her mind racing to make sense of the sight before her. The small figure stirred, her faint breath breaking the silence. The whisper was so soft it could have been imagined. "They are coming." The words lingered in the air, heavy with a warning she could not understand. Zola froze, her gaze darting to the stillness around her. The question left her lips before she could stop it. "Who's coming?" The silence that followed offered no answer. Her chest tightened as the figure's breathing slowed again. Her hands steadied, the hesitation melting into resolve. She lifted the fragile body carefully, her arms cradling the injured figure. The dog stood firm, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. His gaze scanned the shadows as though sensing a threat she couldn't see. Her steps faltered as doubt crept in. She glanced back toward the path leading home, imagining her aunt's angry voice. A decision pressed on her, heavy and unyielding. "I can't leave her here," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear swirling inside her. "She'll die if I don't help." The water behind her rippled, though no breeze stirred the surface. The calm river shifted unnaturally, a faint hum rising from its depths. She felt the vibration underfoot, the strange energy unsettling. The dog growled low, his fur bristling as he moved closer to her side. The baobab trees loomed above, their branches twisting against the dimming sky. The forest felt alive, each step she took watched by unseen eyes. Her grip tightened on the fragile figure as shadows shifted unnaturally around her. "What's happening here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The small hut came into view, its worn edges offering little comfort. She stepped inside, laying the injured figure gently on her mat. Her hands moved quickly, gathering the scraps of herbs and cloth she had saved. Her thoughts spun with questions she could not answer. At the door the dog sat, his ears perked, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside. He listened for sounds she couldn't hear, his steady presence a shield against the unknown. In the silence of the small space, Zola worked, her determination growing stronger with each moment. Whatever came next, she knew she would face it. Zola laid the fragile mermaid on the mat, her hands trembling but steady. The small body barely moved, and the faint shimmer of the tail flickered weakly. She grabbed the small basket of herbs from the corner, her mind recalling the lessons of her grandmother. Her fingers worked quickly, crushing the leaves and mixing them with water. A soft whisper escaped her lips, urging the fragile figure to hold on as she applied the mixture to the wounds. The scratches seemed deep, but she didn't let fear slow her hands. The door creaked open sharply. Her aunt's voice cut through the air, sharp and furious. The sight of the mermaid left her frozen for a moment before the anger returned. She demanded to know why such trouble had been brought into her house. The words spilled out, each one filled with frustration and fear. She warned of danger and the foolishness of meddling with creatures beyond their world. Zola moved quickly, standing between her aunt and the injured creature. Her voice was firm, steady, and defiant. She declared that the child could not be abandoned. Her aunt's threats and warnings hung in the air, but she refused to move aside. The baby stirred. A faint melodic voice broke the tension. It was soft but clear. The single word was filled with gratitude. Zola leaned closer, her tone gentler now, asking the name of the fragile figure. The glow in the mermaid's eyes flickered as she whispered her name. Her voice trembled as she began to explain what had happened. She spoke of shadowy hunters who poisoned the river and captured her kind. Her words carried fear, revealing the greed that drove the men to seek the magical scales. A warning followed. The danger was not gone, they were coming. Her voice quivered as she shared the chilling truth that the hunters would find her before her mother could. The night grew heavier. Shadows danced near the riverbank, torches flickering as figures moved closer. Their leader stepped forward, his gaze scanning the water. His voice was rough and eager as he declared that their prey was near. His men whispered among themselves, one pointing toward the faint outline of the dog near the house. The leader nodded, his voice low and confident as he said the dog would lead them. Outside the house, the dog stood firm. His eyes darted toward the distant glow, and his growls rumbled softly in his throat. The stillness of the night felt wrong, and he waited, his ears twitching at every sound. Inside, Zola moved to the window. The faint glow of torches sent a chill through her. Her voice broke the silence, heavy with the realization of danger. The glow grew brighter, and the low murmur of voices became clearer. She turned quickly, her voice urgent as she said they were being watched. Her hands moved swiftly, gathering what little she could. The decision was made. They couldn't stay. The mermaid had to be taken somewhere safe. The dog led the way as Zola carried the mermaid close to her chest. The night seemed alive with every sound, the snap of twigs and rustle of leaves growing louder behind them. Her breath quickened as she pushed forward, her heart pounding with each step. The shadows followed, closing in as the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The forest was dark and the air felt heavy. Zola moved quickly, clutching Amala close to her chest. The faint sound of snapping twigs behind her grew louder with every step. Her breath came fast, her heart pounding as she pushed forward. Kumi stayed ahead, his growls low and steady, his ears alert to the danger drawing closer. The faint glow of Amala's tail flickered, dimming with each moment. Her soft voice broke the tense silence, trembling as she spoke. The words came slowly, weak and full of fear. Zola glanced down, her voice quiet but firm, urging her to hold on. The footsteps behind them grew louder, voices drifted through the trees, cold and menacing. Zola's mind raced as she glanced back. Her grandmother's teachings came to her in a rush, and she stopped suddenly. Her hands worked quickly, gathering thorny vines and sharp stones from the forest floor. The trap was simple but effective. A heavy step behind her was followed by a sharp cry. One of the hunters stumbled, giving her the moment she needed. The towering trees of the sacred grove appeared ahead, their massive trunks glowing faintly in the moonlight. Relief filled her voice as she whispered to Kumi, urging him forward. She reached the grove and placed Amahla gently on the ground. Her hands trembled as she turned to face the shadows emerging from the forest. The hunters stepped into the grove, their torches casting long, eerie shadows. Their leader's voice was cold and commanding. His words were heavy with threat as he demanded Amahla. Zola didn't move. Her arms spread wide, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. She stood firm, defying his demand. The leader smirked, his men stepping forward. The ground beneath them trembled. The river nearby began to glow, its waters rising unnaturally. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made Kumi bark loudly. The light grew brighter, and a powerful figure emerged from the river. Her golden hair shimmered like sunlight, her voice echoing through the grove with authority. She stepped forward, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Her words cut through the grove, accusing the hunters of poisoning the waters and hunting her people. The leader faltered, his confidence shaken, though he tried to deny the accusations. His voice wavered as he called it business, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. The queen raised her hands, her presence commanding. The glowing forms of ancestral spirits emerged from the trees and river. Their radiant light filled the grove as they advanced toward the hunters. The men froze, their torches flickering weakly in the growing brightness. The leader tried to flee, his steps frantic. Kumi leaped into his path, growling fiercely. The sound stopped him in his tracks. Zola's voice rang out, filled with strength, as she declared that he wouldn't escape. The spirits surrounded him, their glowing forms closing in on the hunters. The ancestral spirits moved forward, their light engulfing the hunters as they were dragged toward the glowing river. The leader shouted in desperation, his voice drowned out by the rushing waters. The grove fell silent as the hunters vanished beneath the surface. The queen turned to Zola, her voice softer now. Gratitude filled her words, as she declared that Zola's bravery had saved them all. Her golden glow began to fade, and the grove returned to its quiet stillness. Zola stood tall, Kumi at her side, as the river shimmered faintly, holding the memory of what had just passed. The queen knelt beside the fragile figure, her glowing hands hovering over the broken tail. Light poured from her fingertips, soft and warm, wrapping the small mermaid in a gentle glow. The cracks in the shimmering scales began to mend, their light growing stronger with each passing moment. The small mermaid stirred, her breaths deepening as her vitality returned. Her eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile touched her lips. The queen turned, her gaze soft but full of strength. Her voice carried warmth and gratitude as she spoke, her words a reflection of her deep respect. Zola nodded, her expression calm and steady. The quiet reply that followed was filled with sincerity, carrying the weight of her decision to act when others might not have. From the folds of her robe, the queen drew a small amulet, its shape like a droplet of water. It pulsed with a soft, steady light, alive with power. Her hands extended as she offered the gift, her words promising protection. The glow of the amulet reflected in the dog's eyes, and his tail wagged in quiet approval. The air grew heavy as the spirits surrounded the hunters, their radiant forms unyielding. Power, the leader's voice rose, desperate and defiant, but the sound was swallowed by the growing roar of the river. The waters surged, glowing with the same ethereal light as the spirits. Their movements were deliberate as they dragged the men toward the edge. The cries and struggles were lost beneath the sound of the river as it claimed them, leaving only silence in their wake. The queen stepped into the river, her presence calming the once turbulent waters. Her voice carried a quiet authority as she spoke, her words a warning and a lesson. The river shimmered in response, its surface reflecting a newfound peace. Zola stood still, her eyes fixed on the glowing forms as they faded beneath the water's surface. The amulet in her hand pulsed gently, its warmth a reminder of the bond now shared. Her gaze shifted to the dog at her side, his steady presence giving her the courage to move forward. Her voice was soft but certain as she spoke, and together they turned toward the path home. The forest was quiet as Zola and Kumi walked through the shadows of the trees. The amulet glowed softly against her chest, its gentle light casting a warm halo around them. The air felt lighter now, the tension from before melting into the night. She glanced at Kumi, her voice soft but steady. The words carried a mix of relief and pride, as if speaking them made the victory feel real. The dog wagged his tail in response, his silent loyalty a comforting presence by her side. The faint glow of the village lights appeared through the trees, guiding their steps. With each one, Zola felt something inside her shift. The weight of fear and doubt which had clung to her for so long seemed to fade. In its place, there was something new. Her voice broke the silence, low but firm, as she spoke to herself. The amulet rested in her hand for a moment, its glow reflecting the quiet strength she now carried. Eyes turned toward her as she reached the edge of the village. The whispers of the curious followed her steps, but she met them with only a quiet smile. The memories of the night clung to her thoughts, each moment a reminder of how courage and kindness could transform even the darkest of challenges. Her silence was not from pride, but from reflection, as though the answers to their questions rested not in words but in the actions she had taken. The river's quiet murmur echoed in her ears as she looked back one final time. The narrator's voice rose in the quiet, carrying the wisdom of the queen's words. The river's calm waters seemed to hold the lesson within them. The glow of the amulet in her hand a constant reminder. Her gaze lingered, as if promising that the balance would not be broken again. The path back home stretched ahead, but the heaviness of the day no longer weighed on her. Kumi's tail wagged gently as they stepped inside, the night around them filled with a peace they had earned together. The amulet's glow caught her eye once more, its steady light a quiet companion to her thoughts. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper as she gazed at it. Her words carried hope, the kind that came from knowing she was no longer the powerless girl she had been. The night settled, quiet and still, but her heart carried the spark of a new beginning.